Raji, thank you for joining us once again.
Absolutely. Pleasure joining you here, Mike. Thank you for having me again.
Today we're talking space. Reminds me, after Donald Trump, reminds me of the Wild West, but instead of stagecoaches, we'll be using spaceships. Pretty exciting times, though, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's especially given what Trump is doing. I think space has been having an extra focus and a lot of headlines in a sense. Whatever he does, it immediately catches the attention of the world, so to say. So there has been some bit of attention on space and what's going on there. But others aren't lagging behind in a sense. Where what's, for instance, what China is doing or what the Russians are doing. It's not that they are keeping quiet, and in fact, the competition in the Asian scene or the Indo-Pacific scene has become a lot bigger, a lot more intensified today, primarily because of China's actions, for instance. If I can talk a little bit about the Indian space program, it was primarily a civilian space program. We were not looking at interplanetary missions or even moon missions or conducting an anti-satellite test, the ASAT test, which India did in 2019 March. These were not part of the original mission for India. But 2007 January, the first successful test of China's ASAT test did show to India that the threats to Indian space program, Indian space assets, are not something in very theoretical terms, but something more real in very, very pragmatic terms. This can affect India's own space assets in space. So what India did in March 2019 with its own ASAT test was to it was trying to catch up or test a capability that already existed in the region, which is China's ASAT capability. Second, it was kind of sending a very clear message to China that if you mess around with my space assets, I can do precisely that. So it was essentially a deterrence game in space. I wish states wouldn't go down that path, but it does look like at this point of time, given a number of different factors, whether it is changing balance of power equations, contentious political relationship between states, sovereignty and territorial issues between states, the Indo-Pacific region in particular is going through sort of a geopolitical churning. And today you are seeing the same geopolitical competition on Earth playing out in outer space as well. So that's the reality today. It's a very unfortunate because whatever you do in space, it has effect on everybody else. It's one of the global commons. That's why we call outer space as part of the global commons in a sense.
It's interesting with Donald Trump. He seems to be inviting the private sector to take the lead. Is that the case in other countries, or is it just primarily the US?
It was primarily the US and a very Western phenomenon. So the private sector participation was something that was quite alien to Asian countries or even Latin America, Africa, and so on and so forth. So it was primarily driven or seen in the context of the Western countries, Western. But today, I think that is changing. That has changed quite a bit, even in the Indo-Pacific countries. China, for instance, has a sizable number of industry, especially the new space and startups. They are a sizable number today, which are also getting a lot of financial and other support from the state. So the Chinese space program today, I would say it is not entirely state driven. It's still 95% state driven, but there's a 5% of space that is being given to private sector. So that's one major change that happened. Japan again has again a state run program, but they also have a sizable number of private sector, bigger industries, not just the new space and startups, but bigger industries playing a bigger role in the Japanese space program. In the case of India, it has been almost completely a state-run program done by the ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, but there is capacity deficit within ISRO to meet all the growing set of requirements, whether it is for communications, your telemedicine, sort of agriculture, weather prediction, whole range of things, and of course the growing security requirements of space. So therefore, there is a capacity deficit within ISRO, and therefore ISRO is kind of been reaching out to the private sector to kind of contribute to the capacity gaps within the ISRO. So there has been some participation of the private sector in the case of India, but not entirely, really. Russia, again, beginning to see some change, but not there yet, in a sense. Russia is sort of allowing certain number of private sector partners to play a role, but you haven't seen a big change in Russia. But the big change happened in China, with more than 100 new space and startups playing a bigger role in this space program in China.
What are some of the most pressing issues or concerns surrounding space?
Several different issues. There are both from a pure civilian perspective as well as from a non-civilian or a security perspective. There are issues that are challenging the safe, secure, and sustainable use of outer space. So if we have to ensure that we are able to have continued access to outer space, I think there are a few things that we need to take care of. There are certain number of challenges. Some of them are natural in a sense. For instance, solar flares, space weather, that's a major issue. But that's not something that you are contributing to in a sense. But there are several man-made issues. There are several our own actions, for instance, that have contributed to polluting outer space. In fact, some of the debates in this regard are very similar to the climate change debate. The question has always been who has gone and polluted outer space, and now who has to bear the brunt of these things now. And if a new space power is coming up, they are told, oh, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, because space is getting crowded, congested and contested. That's a cliche thing, but that's also very true in the case of outer space. So the first and foremost aspect of space is that it has become so crowded, congested and contested, given the geopolitics and the politics at play. But at the same time, what are we doing in terms of lessening the number of lessening this crowding aspect of space? And here you can't say that space is already crowded. So to a newcomer from Latin America or sort of a new player from Asia or Africa, you can't, because they are developing space assets for a number of development missions and kind of things. And you can't tell them that, hey, buddy, it's already closed. The space is now closed. But the fact is that I think we need to take actions particularly on the space security domain, the kind of actions that some of the big players are engaged in. Just last week, Russia sort of had in space an ASAT test, an anti-satellite test in space. So which essentially meant that they had sent a satellite for inspection. So there are a whole range of activities called the rendezvous proximity operations, which are essentially on-orbit satellite servicing. So essentially, this is to extend the life of a satellite by, for instance, if there is some sort of a repair that needs to be undertaken, you send a satellite from Earth, and that can remotely, it's a remote technician, for instance. So it can remotely, from here, you can control and repair that particular satellite in operation already in the space. You can also do refueling of satellites. So there are a whole range of operations that come out of the bracket of on-orbit satellite servicing. So Russia had been doing this inspection satellites for a couple of years now. But this year, just a week before, a month ago, they decided to release a projectile into outer space. And that did seem like a weapon, because those are also going at a very fast speed in a sense. So hitting onto something else could be very, very detrimental to because it can kind of affect one particular satellite, but it can also break into several pieces of debris which are going to be floating around in space for a very long time. But Russia came out and said that it was simply doing an inspection of another Russian satellite. But the way it has been seen is that this is possibly for the first time you're actually seeing a state releasing a particular object into so it is seen as a space weapon. So there are early trends towards space weaponization, purely weaponizing outer space, and that's a dangerous path that countries need to avoid. Then, of course, militarization of space, but that's something that has already happened for quite some time now. From the first Gulf War onwards, countries have learned from the U.S. experience as to how the U.S. had used space assets to to maximize their conventional military operational advantages and so on and so forth. And therefore, militarization is something that has happened for a while. But I think more and more countries are going down that path. But I think that's a puzzle that you can't resolve. If one country thinks that this is useful from a security or a conventional military point of view, then other countries are also going to pursue that. So there is that militarization, weaponization, those two issues. Third is the third important aspect is space debris, and space has become, like I said, so crowded, not just with operational satellites, but you have satellites that have finished their life but are still floating around there. And then there are debris pieces, the rocket debris, and so on and so forth. So there is a ton of material that are floating around, and which can cause huge amount of problem in terms of colliding with another space subject, or collide with another piece of debris, which can result in a much bigger explosion of more debris and so on and so forth. So I think there are space debris has become a huge challenge. In fact, many countries have had to delay their satellite operations, satellite launches, because they have had some sort of a prior information that, oh, there is a space debris that are going to be floating around in this particular area, and we need to avoid. And that is why many more countries are beginning to sort of invest a whole lot of resources in terms of financial as well as human resources in developing what you call the space situational awareness. So you need to be aware, you need to be conscious and aware of the space environment that you're operating in, so that you can avoid. So far, the US has the largest network of space situational awareness networks in terms of radars and sensors and so on and so forth. But their southern hemisphere coverage isn't particularly great. That's where Russia's SSA, the space situational awareness capabilities, come in. The Europeans have a limited SSA capabilities as well. China and India and even Japan are developing limited number of space situational awareness capabilities, because if any serious player in space, if you want to operate in space, you need to be conscious of what's happening in the space environment, and that cannot be done unless you have an SSA capability, the space situational awareness capability. So space debris, and so SSA is required very much if you want to deal with the issue of space debris, but also, like I said in the beginning, the space weather issues, which are more natural challenges in outer space. Then you also have issues such as radio frequency interference. Essentially, because of the crowded nature of space, you can have disturbance in your lines and kind of thing for your satellite communication back and forth and so on and so forth. One final set of issues that I'll talk about is the cyber and electronic warfare in outer space. This is relatively new. Electronic warfare has been there in the past, during the Cold War years as well. But during the current times, you are seeing a spurt in activities with regard to cyber and electronic warfare, because ASATs, anti-satellite tests, are much more disruptive. It creates large amount of debris, so that's a bit of a problem. It gets the whole world's attention and so on and so forth. But in the meantime, countries have been developing the cyber and electronic warfare capabilities to disrupt, to damage, or destroy a particular satellite, and that cyber essentially gives that particular party, whoever is engaged in that particular act, gives them a lot of deniability in a sense. So it's seen as a much more attractive option as compared to ASATs and so on and so forth. Second, it's also extremely cheap. You can buy sort of a jammer, for instance, online for a couple of $100. That's all. So engaging in cyber and electronic warfare measures are seen as a much more affordable, a lot more cheaper, and it gives them a plausible deniability. So these options have become a lot more attractive for states to pursue. And in the last few years, almost for a decade now, you have seen increasing number of incidents involving cyber and electronic warfare. Right now, countries are both China and Russia have been testing out these capabilities. They are not disrupting a particular satellite communication, for instance, for a longer period of time. They're just teasing out the capability to send a message to the US, for instance, to say that, hey, we have this capability right now, so we can do something. and especially this will come into play during a heightened period of conflict or potential crisis in East Asia or somewhere or other, because the US is extremely dependent on space assets for their military communications, military operations, logistics, and whole range of things. So this weakness on the part of the US, China has recognized it and has been trying to use it as a kind of make it a vulnerable point for the US to depend that much on space. So I think these are broadly the kind of challenges, space security problems that we have today, in a sense. But one big problem, okay, it may not be the most technical, but the fact is that the biggest challenge today is the lack of a sort of agreement among big players to come together to find an agreement. So the lack of consensus among major powers today, I see that as the biggest challenge in space.
All these TV shows are coming back to me now. In fact, I'm watching one called War of the Worlds. And, and just listening to what you're saying, it really is a war of the worlds, just about. Just quickly, as we're running out of time, can you bring us up to speed on India's main achievements in space in recent years and what it hopes to achieve in the next few years?
So India has had, like I said in the beginning, a fairly and completely civilian-oriented space program, but it has kind of begun to change in the last, last decade or so. Actually, from 2007, there has been slow changes that have been happening in India's space program. So India has been looking at developing military space characteristics to its space program and so on and so forth, both in terms of institutional sort of innovation, but also developing certain capabilities required for the military. But some of the impressive achievements for India in this regard has been one, in 2008 when India undertook the first moon mission, Chandrayaan-1. That was fairly impressive because especially even though we have been invested in space for a few decades now, India is still a poor country in a sense. And so to devote that kind of resource and develop those capabilities for India, I think that's something that is quite impressive. Second is the second and quite, I think it was pretty surprising to a lot of countries when India undertook its first successful Mars mission, for instance, in 2014. This was, and India became the first Asian country to do that. And we also managed to get the Mars mission done successfully in the first attempt. And I think that was something that was completely took the world by a surprise because one, it's only the fourth country to do so. That is number one. And second, I think there were a lot of questions about why India is engaged in interplanetary missions or even a moon mission when India has a lot of development challenges, poverty, and whole range of things. I think this has always been part of the debate in a sense. But I think the reality is that India has felt the need to demonstrate its capabilities to get a seat at the high table. This is also part of the whole, its ability to be heard, its voice to be heard at the global governance debates. India feels that unless India has crossed certain threshold, demonstrated certain technological capabilities, its voice is not going to be taken seriously. And I think that's been always the one sort of a voice, one particular perspective that has also driven the India's decision to conduct an ASAT test. So because India did not want to have the same experience as it did in the nuclear realm, like the NPT, for instance. If India had conducted a nuclear test way back in the 60s, we would not have been outside of the NPT system and been treated as a pariah for a longest time. So India wanted to avoid that experience, so again went about with the ASAT test. So if I have to come out with some of the impressive missions, I think Chandrayaan, the first moon mission, and then of course the Mars mission, Mangalyaan in 2014, and the ASAT test has also been a fairly an impressive one, even though somewhat destructive. But I think India was responsible enough to conduct the ASAT test at a lower level, lower altitude, so that it doesn't result in huge clouds of debris for a very long time. But there are also other sort of impressive missions that India has in plans. A mission to the sun, mission to study the sun, a mission to the Venus. So there are several more sort of programs in works. But I think more importantly, India is also beginning to look at a lot many more partnerships where with with the US, with France, with I think Australia, we have a lot of opportunities to begin, especially now that Australia has has its own space program and a policy and so on and so forth. So there are, especially from a climate change and environmental perspective, this region requires partnerships in developing certain capabilities, certain satellites to track the environmental challenges, particularly the climate change related challenges, so that we are able to foster an environment both on Earth as well as in outer space, so that it remains accessible throughout the year for future generations as well.
It's exciting times, and how I wish I was about 30 years younger, because I would love to go to Mars or somewhere just for a bit of a holiday or a vacation. But I think that may not be the case with me at the moment. Look, Raji, it was lovely chatting again. Have a lovely week, and we'll talk again shortly. And I was going to say, may the force be with you, as they would say. So
absolutely, thank you, and have a wonderful week ahead, Mike. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.